Movie review, continuing on with the Ice Age series of movie reviews, and today's movie I'm reviewing is Ice Age 2 The Meltdown, which I actually own it on DVD right here now. This is a DVD I've had since I was a kid, but like I said, when I was a kid, I wasn't really the best at handling discs because of scratches and stuff, but as an adult, I am significantly better at handling DVDs, not letting them get scratched. So again, I do need to get a new DVD of this movie as well as the first movie at some point. And yes, I have a very scratched up copy of Ice Age 3 Dawn of the Dinosaurs, but the difference is that a few years ago, one of my mom's friends gave us a whole bunch of movies, and that was one of them on DVD that's actually still in the case, so that DVD should be fine, but I do need to upgrade the first two to a better DVD at some point. But anyways, what is the plot of Ice Age 2 The Meltdown? Well, the plot of this movie is as follows. Manny, Sid, and Diego discover that a massive wall of ice acting as a dam is melting and threatens to flood their valley. The herd leads an evacuation to a boat at the far end, meeting Ellie, a female mammoth who believes she's a possum along the way. So that's basically the plot synopsis to this movie, and you have a lot of returning cast members to this movie. Especially, you have a lot of returning cast members as well as some new members of the cast. You got Ray Romano as Manny, you got John Leguizamo as Sid, you got Dennis Leary as Diego, you got Chris Wedge as Scrat, you got Sean William Scott as Crash, and I like Sean William Scott as an actor from the American Pie movies, some of my favorite comedies. You got Josh Peck as Eddie, you got Jay Leno as Fast Tony, and Queen Latifah as Ellie. So this movie's got a pretty good cast. But anyways, how was this movie received? Well, when it came to the reception of Ice Age 2 The Meltdown, as you guys remember, Ice Age 1 was a very well-received movie by both critics and audiences, and regarded as a good family movie with a good kids movie with a good story and good characters. However, remember how I said the first Ice Age movie was very well received by critics and audiences? Ice Age 2, on the other hand, got mixed reviews by critics, and it was considered a step down from the first movie. But however, that did not stop this movie from being a big hit at the box office. This movie was made on a budget of $80 million, and it ended up being even more successful than the first one, because the first one only made $383 million. This sequel made $667 million worldwide. And it was released on March 31st, 2006. But now as for and Chris Wedge, who directed the first one, who does not the talking because he doesn't really voice the character, but Chris Wedge is the guy who did the noises for the squirrel that doesn't talk named Scrat. He's the one who directed the first movie, but Chris Wedge, he did not return to direct this movie. Carlos Saldanha, which I probably butchered that name, he directed this one, which after this, he would go on to direct both the Rio movies, which I like the first one for what it is. Not really a big fan of the second one, but I'll cover those eventually at some point down the road. But as for my reaction, I do like this sequel. It is rather good. I do think it is a slight step back from the first one, but it's still a good sequel in my opinion. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into my review. So the movie starts off of course, with our iconic squirrel, Scrat, who is basically trying to get a hold of his acorn, like in the first movie, but he's basically trying to climb up a giant wall of ice, which, like I said, is acting as a dam. And, of course, he tries to get his acorn. It goes horribly wrong. But Scrat was funny. Scrat was funny and charming in the first three movies. I really feel like with the fourth one, he was starting to lose his charm. And, I'll get to that when I get to that. But in these first three movies, Scrat is a good character, and again, his scenarios are funny. But then, not long after that, I like the part where after Scrat fails to get his acorn, he's on top, not really a water slide because water slides did not exist during prehistoric times, but like there's a giant ice slide, which is basically the animals' version of water slide, and then one of them just zips by fast, knocking him off course and stuff like that. And then of course we get a scene where we reunite with our characters from the first movie, Manny, Sid, and Diego, and Sid is basically trying to be like a camp counselor, basically of the Ice Age world and stuff like that, and it's not going well. The kids are beating him up and stuff like that, and then Manny, I like the part when one of the beavers like, let's bury him alive, and but Manny and Diego are able to put a stop to that. And then I like the part where basically Manny is telling the kids a story and about a burrow, and then as soon as Manny says, and they lived happily ever after, and then the beaver asks, why does the burrow go home? And then Manny says, because he wanted to be with his family. And then a bird says, I think he should go to the girl burrow. That's a better love story. And then Manny says, well, when you tell your burrow story, that's what he'll do. And then I like the part where the deer says, burrow is a demeaning name. It technically is called a wild A word. And then Manny says, fine. The wild A boy came home with his wild A mother, which I thought was actually a funny joke, especially for putting that in a kid's movie. And, that joke makes the kids laugh. And then the beaver says, that's not a very satisfying ending. And then Manny says, they lived happily ever after. You cannot get more satisfying than that. One big happy family. And then the bird says, well, then where's your big happy family? And as soon as the bird says this, Manny has a sad look in his eyes because he remembers what happened. Because now, for those of you guys who have not seen the first movie, even though I'm sure most people have, this review will have spoilers. So if you haven't seen any of the Ice Age movies, I would recommend watching the first 3 and then coming back to this review. Or if you don't care for spoilers, then oh well. But basically, as soon as the bird says, where's your big happy family, Manny is start to have a sad look in his eye, because if you remember in the first movie, we basically learned that on a cave painting that Manny, when he was younger, his mammoth family was killed by a human tribe, which, in the first movie really added emotional depth to the character. And right as soon as after, we see Manny's look on his face, I wrote, this is a very funny part where the saber-toothed tiger Diego, he basically says, and then the pesky tiger ate the pesky little kids, and then Diego roars, just chasing after the kids, scaring them away, but then he stops chasing them. That's a rather funny scene. And we're introduced to a character named Fast Tony, voiced by Jay Leno, who basically says that, that there's going to be a huge flood, and that, that the water, that the dam is breaking, which the wall of ice is acting as the dam. And basically Sid does something very stupid, so Manny and Diego try to go up to the top to stop Sid from doing something stupid, but then they see that at the top that the character Fast Tony, voiced by Jay Leno, was actually right, that the ice is melting. And then basically Manny, he basically tries to warn the people that there's going to be a flood, but nobody believes him. And because not too long before then, basically Manny told Fast Tony, hey, stop with this doomsday stuff, stop trying to scare the kids. And he basically says that Fast Tony was right. And then I like the part where Fast Tony's like, I am. I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, yes, of course I'm right. Basically pretending that he knew, but when in reality he didn't. And then there's the whole scene where Sid, Manny, and Diego walk away, and we see this ugly frozen creature in the ice that it kind of has like the snout of an alligator, but it like has like these weird flippers on the side of it and spikes on its back, like. And then I like the visual part where it just like the entire creature is frozen, but like the eye just moves at the camera like as soon as they walk away in a very nice shot. And and I think that this movie definitely does a good job. And another thing I like about this sequel is how it really, I mean, Diego was a great character in the first movie, but this movie makes me like Diego even more as a character for reasons I'm going to get to. But And I will say that the animation is a step up here. Now, do not get me wrong, the first Ice Age is a classic, and the animation was really good for its time. And there's even still bits of animation in that first movie that hold up really well, but there's also some parts that do look a little dated. But here, keep in mind, this came out in 2006, about 4 years after the first, so, it was definitely a step up in terms of the animation. And this animation was definitely a step up. And another thing I like about this movie is I really like, the part where we are, and I also really like the part where, but before Manny and all the characters leave, a vulture comes down and basically tells them that basically what Fast Tony said is true, and that the bowl's gonna fill up and there's no way out. And basically he says, and the bird basically says, and the vulture says, unless you can make it to the end of the valley, then you should be fine. And the bird tells them there's a boat. And basically what they mean by boat is there's this really, really giant log where, not really, I wouldn't really say it's like a log, but it's like this, it's part of a log, but it's more so, I don't know how to describe it. The best way I can describe it is a really, really, really large piece of tree trunk, but if it wasn't fully, but not a full tree trunk, if that makes sense, where it kind of curves down like this to where there's enough room for all the animals to fit. And it's a really, really big one. If I had to estimate how big this boat is, I would, they're a boat, because boats didn't exist. Basically, this animal's version of the boat, I would estimate that it's at least, I don't know, maybe 1,000 feet long, something like that. And basically, the vulture tells them that the animals only have 3 days to get there. Otherwise, it's basically going to flood the whole thing. And that the dam's going to completely break. And then I like the part where the vulture's boom, basically scaring the kids. And then one of them passes out. That's a funny scene. And the vulture says, there is some good news, though. The more of you die, the better I eat. And then this shocks all of them, making them gasp. He said, I didn't say it was good news for you. That right there I thought was a good bit of dark humor. I'll admit that. But I gotta say, one of the most, and this is a PG-rated kids movie, keep that in mind, but one part I think is rather well done is where James, which is one of the children of this anteater, is blowing in the blowing his trunk in the water. And then, now granted, we get a scene where we see it through this animal's point of view. We think it's gonna be one of the monsters I said that was frozen in the block from earlier, but really it's just one of the turtles, which is basically Fast Tony's friend. But basically that turtle jumps up and scares him with a snorkel in his mouth. And granted, we don't see anything, but we get the implication where the turtle is using that snorkel, and then the snorkel gets dragged under, and we hear a gasp sound, basically getting the implication what happened and stuff like that. And again, you don't see it, but you get the implication, and I think it's rather well done. And then, close to the 20-minute mark of the movie, Manny said, what if what Fast Tony said is right? What if I'm really the last mammoth? And stuff like that. But then, close to 22 minutes into the movie, Sid and Diego are in the forest, and then we're introduced to these two possums named Crash and Eddie, which Crash is voiced by Sean William Scott, and Josh Peck, who did Eddie. Now, I'm a big fan of Sean William Scott as an actor. I'm a big fan of the American Pie movies. Those movies are funny. He was absolutely funny as Stifler in those movies, which were definitely not movies made for kids, but they're really funny movies. So to see him in this type of kids movie is interesting. I thought was an interesting casting choice. And you also got Josh Peck as Eddie. And I know some people think Crash and Eddie are annoying, and I mean, I guess I can see why, but I've always found these characters funny. And the whole scene where these two possums are just messing with Sid and Diego, and they're basically inside these holes. It's basically like whack-a-mole, but Sid and Diego are trying to get them. And then they both say, do you surrender? And then Sid and Diego say never. And they're awesome. And then they shoot them with a bunch of pellets in a rather funny scene. And then about close to 39 minutes into the movie, Ellie, the female mammoth, voiced by Queen Latifah, is hanging upside down in a tree branch and falls out. And basically, Manny says, I knew I wasn't the last one. And Ellie thinks he's talking about something else. And Ellie is under the impression she's a mammoth, but she thinks that she's a possum for reasons I'm going to get to. And she said, these are my brothers, Crash and Eddie, and stuff like that. And again, I think that Crash and Eddie have really good chemistry with each other. And basically, at first, Manny is not for the idea of Ellie and these two possums coming with, but eventually they agreed to it. And and again, I like their back and forth banter, and I like this new group of characters I like Ellie, I like Crash and Eddie. I think they're good characters, and I also do think that there is some rather good again, the scenes with Scrat are awesome. Like I like the part where Scrat a little earlier on in the movie, he's trying to get an acorn, but he gets stuck under the water under an ice sheet later. And he's trying to swim to get the acorn, and it goes horribly wrong. Again, that scene is funny. You can never go wrong with Scrat. Well, Scrat was funny and charming. Around the fourth movie is when, again, the fourth movie is kind of where he lost his charm for reasons I'll discuss. But that's a whole other topic, whole other video, whole other day. And I also like the scene about 31 minutes into the movie where Manny, Sid, Diego, Ellie, Crash, and Eddie are on top of this giant ice, and basically like a giant ice sheet. They're walking, and that creature that, like I said, was frozen in the ice earlier, who's no longer frozen, as well as another monster alongside, a water monster, basically jump out of the ice, cracking part of the sheet, freaking out Crash and Eddie, and they basically have to run away from it. And another thing I do like about it is this whole scene, and we basically learned that Manny is scared of water and stuff like that, which I think creates a really good character arc for him for reasons we're going to get to. And later on in the movie, about close to 45 minutes in, we finally get to learn some of Ellie's backstory, where basically, as a little kid, Ellie, she comes across a part of the woods that looks familiar to her, and then we see a flashback to when she was a little kid where she was accidentally left behind by the other mammoths, and she's sad and under a tree covered by tree branches, but then there's an adult possum and two little kid possums who we know are the younger versions of Crash and Eddie, and basically they raised up Ellie, and then Ellie finds out the truth, which I thought that was a rather nice way to touch upon her character arc. And another one of my favorite scenes, honestly, this is probably my favorite scene involving Scrat in the movie. It is on the DVD cover, but I like the part where Scrat is he's trying to get his acorn, but he falls in the water holding the acorn, smiling, and then we see a bunch of fish, and then all of a sudden they have all of his razor sharp teeth because they're a bunch of piranhas, and then Scrat basically has to fight the piranhas for his acorn, and then he does martial arts going taekwondo on them. I thought that's, just going martial arts all on them. I thought that scene was funny. But another thing I like about this movie is, like I said, the character arcs, and basically, now I do think most of the humor does work well for the most part in this movie, but there are a few scenes that I thought could have been cut out. For example, the whole Glorious Food song, I didn't really care for. I mean, even as a kid, I didn't really care for that part, and also the whole part involving the Sloth Tribe. I think you could have cut that out, and while Ellie is a great character, I do wish we maybe would have gotten a little more involving her, but I mean, those are minor complaints aside, and I like how closer to the end of this movie where Diego, basically, he has to get over his fear because basically Sid is about to drown, and, well, Sid's in the water going away, but Crash and Eddie are trying to stop Sid, and I really like the fact that Diego was afraid of water, but he got over his fear and he decided to save Sid. I thought that was a rather nice touch. And I like how at the end of this movie, oh, and another part I forgot to mention, all the other animals, minus the exception of Sid, Manny, Ellie, Diego, Crash, and Eddie, all of the animals, minus the exception of them, safely get to the boat that, was being talked about and stuff like that. And, of course, there's the whole scene where after those characters I mentioned are on top of a rock after being saved, Scrat climbs up top. He basically climbs up top the ice wall, and part of it cracks open, like a big crack goes open, and he falls down it, and, the water starts pouring through, basically meaning that after this big flood, basically making the water go away, and, the animals are able to walk on land again. And I like how at the end of the movie, Manny decides to go off with Ellie and stuff like that, and Manny, Sid, Diego, Crash, and Eddie, and Ellie are now a team. And then we get a scene closer to the end of the movie where, and this is one of my favorite parts of the movie, where Scrat is basically in heaven, and heaven, basically his version of it, where there's like a golden gate with like an acorn on it, and he sees a bunch of acorns, and he sees the big golden acorn, and he's going for it, but he's not able to because the air sucks him back, and then he falls back to Earth. And then I like the part where Sid is able to save his life, and then Scrat is, worried because he doesn't have his acorn, basically thinking that Sid took it, and then he gets angry again, and then he goes all full martial arts on Sid, trying to karate chop him and stuff, and, Sid's trying to run away. He's like, hey, I saved your life. Like, again, good stuff. So at the end of the day, Ice Age, The Meltdown, not quite as good as the first movie, but a pretty good sequel in my opinion. And if you're a fan of the first movie, I would recommend this sequel. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give Ice Age, The Meltdown an 8 out of 10. So yeah. Anyways, guys, that was my review. And next up, I will be tackling my favorite of the series, Ice Age 3, Dawn of the Dinosaurs. But until then, we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye now.